The time has come to circle back to the first pillar we started the event with, and that is peace. I spoke with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya about democracy in the early afternoon. We will now focus on security, resilience, and foresight. To discuss that, we have invited a special guest, Mircea Geoană, the Deputy Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first such senior NATO representative originating from the emerging Europe region. Mr. Secretary General, can you join me here on the stage, please? Thank you very much for joining us today on this occasion. So I wanted to start this discussion with a question about the most recent developments. So we've seen, things happening in Afghanistan. We've seen things happening in Belarus as well. And of course, on top of that, we had the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So where do you see emerging Europe in that whole picture when it comes to security?
First of all, I would like to congratulate Andrew and Emerging Europe. You've been doing an amazing job over the years. We've met in previous incarnations, so call on me and I'll be there. Now, we are entering one of the most complex moments probably in modern history, because we see a combination of factors that are probably unique in their complexity, in the unexpected result of the combination of these factors. So a world with great power competition again, that's important. Secondly, we see transformations in the way in which the economy, technology, politics, culture, and the way in which citizens see their own lives in flux. So this combination of significant transformational trends is something that makes us in NATO, with the business of protecting 1 billion people from 30 nations, to keep them safe, to keep them prosperous, to keep them sustainable, to keep them resilient. That's the business that we started 72 years ago. So this level of complexity is met by us in NATO by a significant effort at adaptation. Secretary General Stoltenberg initiated, and our leaders at the summit in Brussels in June approved NATO 2030. And you'll not be surprised that there we speak about technologies and their disruptive effect, that we speak about resilience, about climate change and security, that we discuss about great power competition and so on and so forth. Now, I'm coming from a country that has been, I don't want to get into intergenerational conversation here, but roughly half of my life, I spent it in communist Romania. And I have to say that I'm coming out from that experience with something that is very difficult to explain to the younger generations. Because, like I'm telling my son, why do you stay in line for hours to get, 3 pieces of egg and, half a kilo of anything? He said, move to the next shop. He couldn't understand the idea that things can be rationed in communist days. But having said that, I think that this newly influential members of the Euro-Atlantic family, the countries, what you call emerging Europe, have been not only being invited to join NATO and the EU, first NATO and then EU. Each and single one of our nations, first NATO in various waves, and then the EU. And the process is not completed yet. Open Doors is still here with us. But I would say that what these countries are bringing are not only bringing a more, if you want, more intense sense of historical memory from the experience of communism, but also a more intense sense of historic memory coming from the fact that this part of Europe has always been part of this perennial conflict in Europe for many, many centuries. So I think these countries are bringing to the alliance also a sense of a more intense sense of geography and history. That's normal. But also they bring a sheer desire, and this is something we value, And this is something that all of us, from America and Canada all the way to the Baltics or to the Balkans, we are really appreciating the fact that they come with fresh energy, that there is a sense of catching up with the lost historical time. I'm so happy when I see the numbers of the fact that after joining NATO and the EU, the countries of the region, my country, Romania, the GDP of Romania quadrupled from 2004 to 2021. Quadrupled. Of course, things are not perfect, things could be better. I'm seeing with great pride that a number of the countries in emerging Europe have crossed the threshold of now becoming advanced economies. Yes. Others are still there. Poland is very close, Hungary is there, Romania would come. So I think that, let me say this in a simple way. Between peace, security, and prosperity, there is a link which we should explain more. There is no way in which you can thrive, in which you can have a decent life, in which you can have a safe life, a prosperous life, if there is no security. So NATO is the very foundation of everything we build upon. And of course, working with the EU, working with other players, that's something also important.
So tell me, you mentioned the two, you mentioned new member states at NATO. So how they have, I understand they have been integrating quite well. I'm talking about North Macedonia, Montenegro.
The force of transformation that the perspective of joining NATO and the European Union, the Euro-Atlantic community, is just one of the most impressive, historically speaking, incentives for transforming one society. Because, you know, transforming societies, that's easy to be said, it's more complicated to be done. I used to be a politician myself, it's not easy. So you can come with the most noble intentions, and there is always resistance, inertia, sometimes you don't know the path, sometimes you have to improvise. But the fact that there is such a clear perspective of joining NATO, which made a transformation in the most delicate part of post-communist Europe's societies, which is the system of defense, of national security, of intelligence, things that in the old days were having a sense of reflecting those values. Mm-hmm. The transformation of our societies was basically triggered and turbocharged by Euro-Atlantic integration. Of course, the EU, with its massive transformational power, sometimes you also see, also in the European Union, that sometimes not all allies see eye to eye, not all EU member states see eye to eye on everything. That's normal, because we all reflect our own national interest and our geographies. But I would say that this is probably the comparison with the Asian tigers of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Just 2-3 countries in the world were able to come from developing nations to advanced economies. I think that this part of Europe, because of the integration in the West, reintegration, rejoining the family of the West, is and will be one of the most successful transformations for the better, probably in European history. And that's not a small feat.
So after the Russian annexation of Crimea, NATO came up with the readiness plan. So we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about Georgia being sort of closer to NATO right now. How do you see this enlargement, so to speak, process going forward?
Listen, first of all, we'll never accept, we'll never recognize the illegal, immoral annexation of Crimea. This is something that is all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think our friends in the Baltic countries know what that means, that this is something that is totally unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And that's, in a way, responding to this very aggressive stance of Russia. NATO, in a way, was obliged, because we are a defensive organization, defensive alliance, to adapt. So we strengthened our flanks. We have enhanced and tailored for presence in the Baltics, in Poland, in the Black Sea, in Romania and Bulgaria. We are assisting our partners in Georgia and Ukraine. Just yesterday we had an important meeting in NATO with the two of them discussing about Black Sea security. Mm-hmm. So what do you call our deterrence and defense is solid, and this is something that NATO does very, very well. Let me also be very clear that as we condemn Russia's aggressive stands in many directions, in many geographies, in multiple domains, we still encourage Russia to return to dialogue with us. We've been calling on Russia to rejoin the table of the NATO-Russia Council for 2.5 years already. So while we stay very strong when it comes to Russia, to terrorists, to other threats to our security, we're also ready to engage in dialogue because there are things that we need to do together as a global community.
So if you look at the entire emerging Europe region, from your perspective, what are the largest threats, so to speak, for the region? Security threats, obviously.
Of course, we cannot ignore more traditional threats. I spoke about Russia. Russia is building up its arsenal in many, many ways. You spoke about Belarus. We have Zapad 21 as we speak. So Russia is not only to the east of the alliance, is also to the south. They are present in the Mediterranean. They are present up north. They are present very aggressively in cyber, in hybrid, in disinformation campaigns. So that's a pretty complex issue. But speaking of the DNA of NATO, which means permanent adaptation to changing environments, that's what we do. And NATO 2030, that I mentioned before, the work on the strategic concept, the new strategic concept of NATO, which just started just a few days ago and will be culminating with a new strategic concept at the NATO summit in Madrid in 2022. These are all, for all allies from all geographies, but because we speak about this region, also for this region, which is so important to us, this means that we have to make sure that more traditional deterrence and defense is solid, and we are working on that. It's credible, it's real, it's there for the case, in the case that might be needed. But then we have to make sure that while being very solid, very strong here, as we always have been, that we also cover what we call a broader definition of security, a much broader definition of security. And speaking of adaptation of NATO, at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, our leaders, I mean, in a sort of speaking of foresight, and I know that Maroš Šefčovič will be here, yes, and I applaud the work he's doing in the Commission on this one, and his recent report is just great on yes, foresight in the EU. But if you look at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, our leaders decided many things, but two things that are also so relevant today. They decided that cyber will become the fourth operational domain in NATO, after land, sea, and air, of course. And also they adopted for the first time the first, what we call baseline requirements, indicators for resilience. In 2019, when our leaders met in London, our leaders, and again, look at what the conversation today, decided for NATO to have the fifth operational domain, which is space. And look at the complexity of things we see also in the outer space. So what we always do is to make sure that, number one, we stay strong and credible in deterrence and defense, and also we respond to these new threats. And I have to say that looking at the countries in emerging Europe, I see tremendous talent. And this is something that makes me so proud. I'm seeing centers of excellence, the one in Tallinn on cyber, the one in Budapest on human emergencies.
But also in Bucharest.
Romania started now a Euro-Atlantic Center on resilience with the ambition to serve both NATO and the EU with its services. I'm seeing Poland becoming such and being such a strong ally and such a strong voice in transatlantic affairs. So I believe that because there is also something else with our region, I can say this. Because of our historical memory, I think we have a sort of an extra historical radar, sensing danger, somewhere in our historical memory. I think from our forefathers. And remembrance, a very complicated history and geography. So when I say that our radars are always active, I also say that the big radar, which is the trust in the sanctity of Article 5, in the solemnity of our mutual commitment to each other in NATO, this is something which is so solid, and this is why all these nations wanted to join NATO. Nobody was asking Romania, my country, but we are running like crazy to make sure that we get there. Why? Because between security and prosperity, between peace and resilience, and between the past and the future, security is, if you want, the continuum. And this is what NATO provides to all of us.
So let's have a look at, let's circle back to the recent events, which I started with. I remember my discussion with the defense minister of Georgia, who said that, well, you cannot be prepared for any of the dangers or threats that Russia is posting or creating, basically. So do you have some sort of advice for individual nations within the emerging Europe region, how they could prepare for this unexpected, completely unexpected? Or how can they expect the unexpected?
In a way, foresight is not mathematics. You just analyze trends and you try to imagine the black swans or the situations that might create significant trouble. But I think that what we have been discussing and adjusting to in NATO when we speak about societal resilience. And we have moved to this concept, speaking of Warsaw in 2016, from whole of government approach. Initially we believed that if not only the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or national security apparatus would be the ones dealing with resilience, with shocks. What does resilience mean? How to absorb and recover from a massive shock. That shock could be a pandemic, like we still have one, or it could be anything else. Natural catastrophe, God forbid, tension or even war. And as we discovered, also the fact that not even the whole of government approach is not enough to make sure that one nation or one organization can really recover fast enough and in decent conditions enough from a massive shock, we progressively moved our thinking and our action towards the concept of societal resilience. This means our businesses, this means our citizenry, this means our media, this means our civil society, this means, if you want, the institutional, but also the civic infrastructure of our societies. This is what we are working right now. Again, I applaud the fact that the European Union is also embarking on resilience. And among the many things we do together between EU and NATO in our strategic partnership, resilience is one of the topics that our leaders have chosen to work together upon. So the advice to anyone else is, number one, don't believe that even a very competent government can cope alone with something like this. Try to engage your citizenry and also learn from the good things and bad things from the others. Because sometimes you also learn from mistakes, not only from the good success stories.
So you're saying that the collaboration between the public sector, the government, and NGOs is also a way going forward?
What I call the holy triad, which is government, business, and civil society. And if you want, this is also something that democracies. And I still believe there are many questions about our democratic systems. I mentioned the fact that our citizens, especially our young citizens, are sometimes questioning the way in which our democratic system works, our institutions work, in which our capitalism works. But that's, again, I believe that this permanent quest for a better society, for more decency in human life, that this model of ours, based on democracy and free markets, is something which is not static, is moving forward. I think this is the major strength that we have in the democratic world when we have this stiff competition, great power competition with countries that believe in authoritarian and very sometimes totalitarian regimes. I believe that sometimes that this might be seen as a sign of losing time, there's too much procrastination, too much conversation, too much... No. In the end, when your citizens, when your people are engaged in this conversation, it's a matter of only of time before we get to a point when we improve the way in which we operate, we improve our contract, social, economic, defense, or moral contracts in our society. So I have tremendous belief that our way of life would prevail.
So you mentioned that that NATO has been around for over 7 decades right now, and then we were also talking about an increasing number of members. But of course, the more members you have, the more countries are involved within the organization, the more voices you have, and sometimes those voices are not always in unity, I would say. And we've heard that within the European Union, we've heard that within NATO as well. How do you think? What do you think we could do? What we should do to make sure that all individual NATO member states speak with one voice?
First of all, we are democracies, and democracies, I mentioned earlier, it's this kind of a human experiment when you don't expect to have the same result at the end of your democratic process in one country or a different country. And again, 30 nations, different geographies, different historical experiences, even different levels of development, and different kind of conversation in our societies. But as differences and situations where we don't see eye to eye on every single issue do appear, will be absurd not to appear. This means that we'll have some form of non-democratic system of organizing ourselves. The moment we get to real business, to the issues of deterrence and defense, to the issues of defending each other and being there for the other, the moment we get to the issues that are about all of us and not only about each of us, at that moment we see unity. We've seen unity after 9/11, with the first time Article 5 being invoked. We've seen in difficult times unity. We also see unity, of course, when there is sunshine. So I would not overestimate the fact that sometimes there are issues that, because of national interest, because of circumstances, allies are not identical in everything, but on the big things. And look at the final communiqué of the NATO summit of last June, with President Biden for the first time attending the NATO summit. Look at the ambition that you see there. That was all 30 nations negotiating. I cannot give details about the long hours, hundreds of hours of tough negotiation, because everybody tries to defend their own. But in the end, we came strong, united, and this is the same thing we'll have, I know, in Madrid in 2022.
So we also know that NATO has its strategy now. How do you imagine the development of the organization, within the next, let's say, 20 years? The strategy looks at 2030, but how do you imagine that going forward? I know we've touched on that several times already, but in different questions. But I would like you to look at it more holistically, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And also the role of emerging Europe in that organization.
It is clear that the pace of transformation in the world will continue to intensify. It's clear that transformations of our economies, of our societies, of the way in which we conduct national security and warfare will continue to adapt and to change. We also know for sure that there will be need for defense, will be need for strong national security, will also be need for cooperation and collaboration around the world. I'm ask Maros Sefcovic because the Commission looks up to longer than, but I would say that I know that NATO will be as relevant in 2040 as it was in 1949. I know that the bond between North America and Europe, including emerging Europe, all of us in Europe and our North American friends, will be as relevant in 2040 as it was in 1949. I know that the need for democratic nations from all over the world, to come together and defend our interests and our values, as it was the case in 1949, will be also the case in 2040. And if these fundamental pieces of seeing each other as part of one family, everything else is adaptation, which we already have in our DNA. So I'm absolutely convinced also that what are now the newer members of NATO today, emerging Europe, will be, of course, in time even more mature. Yes. They will be even more influential. They will also be able to really share the burden and be as ambitious as I know the region is in moving forward.
So we just to summarize, we should say that emerging Europe should actually feel secure.
I think all of us in Europe and in North America should feel secure. And I also know that NATO is the indispensable precondition for peace, for prosperity, and for decent lives. And this is something that we are so adamant in continuing to invest in this organization and believe in our alliance and our values.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Mircea Geoană, the Deputy Secretary of NATO, thank you very much for joining us today.